Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, excellent. So this is data time travel with temporal tables, and my name is Sam Nasser. A little bit about me, been a software developer since 1995. Started an organization called NIS Technologies. Some of you visited our booth outside earlier today. We provide consulting and education services. I've been certified from Microsoft with a few certifications. I run the Cleveland C# VB.NET user group, and yes, I am a .NET developer. I also headed up a .NET study group online, and I've been actively involved in being an author for Visual Studio Magazine, and grateful to have been Microsoft MVP since 2013. Some general information. I'm sure you all know where the restroom is by now, right? Being that it's end of day. Never hurts to go over that one. In any case, please keep in mind, participation is always encouraged. And last but not least, if you would please mute your cell phones. How many here are from the Cleveland area? All right. How many of you here are .NET developers? Okay. All right. So if you're in the Cleveland area and a .NET developer, feel free to join us at this user group. If you're not in the Cleveland area, obviously it's a little difficult, but you can register for the information, and then there are links to the recordings that are posted on YouTube. While I'm on the user group tree stump for a second, how many of you do not attend user groups in your area? Shame, shame, shame. Okay, it's not so many. It's not so bad. Why do you not attend? If you do not attend, right. Had to call them out on it. So for those of you that do attend, what's the advantage of attending a user group? Networking, knowledge. Some user groups, yes, depending on which one you choose. But there is great value in not just the technical content, but also the networking aspect. One of the Microsoft evangelists once said, the most important person in the room is the one sitting next to you, not the one standing in front. So it's important to get out and network and attend these meetings. Did you have a question, sir? So you got into being of course, right. So you got into being a DBA by the peer pressure of your peers, essentially what you're saying. Gotcha. All right, so this afternoon's presentation is on temporal tables, and this is a feature in SQL Server. It was based on a ANSI standard, and essentially anytime we see temporal table, it's the same as that it's a system version table, meaning the system maintains a version of our records for that specific table. So it was a new feature that was newly supported in 2016 and then carried over to 2017. However, other databases have had it for some time. So because it's a new feature in SQL Server, it doesn't have all the capabilities that other databases might have for their historical or versioning tables. What it does is it maintains the current and past states of modified rows, and it's all past states until we purge them from the system. It's a standard feature in all editions of 2016 as well as 2017, and essentially everything that I'm going to show you is going to be implemented via T-SQL, no additional configuration needed. So diving right in, the requirements for setting up a temporal table. Essentially, you need a primary key on your current table, as we would with any other table. You need to specify 2 period columns, and they have to be date time 2. We could give them any name we want, but they must be made non-nullable, and they must be made date time 2 types. We're going to specify the start column, that it must include the phrase generated always as row start, and then the end column that we specify, also the same, generated always as row end. Then towards the end of our SQL clause, we're going to specify a period for system underscore time, and we're going to use these 2 columns that we previously defined in steps 1 and 2. After we're done doing that, we're going to specify system versioning on, and then give it a name for our history table. And so down towards the bottom, you see an example of that where we're creating table departments. Here we specify our primary key being an ID field. We specify some additional fields, and then the 2 critical fields, valid from, notice the type, and the clause generated always as row start, and this must be non-nullable. Same thing with a valid to. And then after we define these two fields, we specify the field names in the clause period for system time. So this is all in the initial creation of a new table. So we're just creating a table here, and we specify these columns with those clauses. Now that we specified everything and we got everything in place, we must specify with system_versioning and turn that on. And while we're turning it on, we want to give it the name of the historical table. So what this is doing, it's creating our current table where all of our current records will reside. And then by us setting up the temporal table, it will also generate the historical table, and then it will connect the two through this clause. Specifying the history table equals department history. This essentially allows us to give the name to the historical table. We certainly don't have to. However, the name that SQL Server will generate will be pretty ugly. So you want something user-friendly, so it's better to specify it from the get-go.
Sam, quick question on the date time too. Can you specify anything less than 7?
No, sir. It needs that level of precision.
Okay.
I will go into it later. Essentially, the start and end column, they specify when this record was active, that duration. It was started on March 30th at noon, for example, and that record was no longer valid as of March 30th at 1:30 p.m. Right. And we'll see that through a demo in a bit. They both get created because they're all mentioned and specified in the same clause. You can create it in a different schema or elsewhere if that's what you're after. Different database? I'd have to look into that. I don't think so, because now we're too far apart. And you'll see why as we go forward with it. Essentially, every update to the current table will automatically modify the historical table. So if you have it in a separate database, that just won't fly because there's no control of the first database over the second database. Meaning you could take the second database offline, right? So, but, right, but you can have it in separate schemas. I'm sorry?
Backup file groups for different locations.
Backup file groups?
That's what I'm just thinking out loud.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Okay.
We can create already existing table of the temporal table.
I'm sorry?
For the existing table, that's it. We are creating a main table as well as temporal table in this instance.
Correct.
So if I want to have the existing table to be a temporal table, can that be done with the
Ironically, you should mention that because that is my next slide. So assuming we already have an existing table, then we can enable the temporal feature on an existing table. But again, in the current table, we now have to execute 2 alter statements. So if our current table does not have the start and end times, we must specify that. Furthermore, we have to specify default values because this is new columns that we're introducing. After we're done doing that, now we also have to specify another alter statement where we're now going to turn system versioning on the current table and then connect it with the historical table. So essentially, we can do it both on table creation and on existing tables. An existing history table, if it matches the schema. It would have to match, right? Because as soon as you execute this system versioning on, it's going to do various checks, and we'll see that in an upcoming slide. Approximately a dozen or so different checks, and one of them is the schema must be identical. Okay? Other questions? Okay. Is it a viable option to replace CDC? Depends on what you're looking to get out of CDC, and that's also in an upcoming slide. I have a very anxious group this afternoon. I like that. Yeah. Either or, CDC or CT, they still don't give you the same value as temporal tables. You have to have faith in what I'm selling here.
One of the limitations with AWS, you can't use CDC with EMS. So we're having a big time trying to get our databases over to AWS.
Have one word solution for that.
I understand.
There you go, Azure, right?
They're not going to double dip.
Well, okay. In any case, so back to our conversation, we can either set it up on when we create a table or enable it on an existing table. So after we do that, what are the usage scenarios for using temporal tables? Essentially, because it's out of the box and it's built in within the database engine, it allows us for querying a table at a specific point in time. And we'll see through the demo, if you have a customer that constantly changes their email address and they're complaining about not getting order information or what have you, we can actually pull up and see that in fact it was sent to a specific email address, but they just changed it often. So it allows you to query the data going back to a specific point in time. It is for slowly changing dimensions of a data warehouse. So if you have something that's rapidly changing, you're going to get a performance hit on that because we're now not updating one table, we're updating two tables. Also, it's useful for auditing to find out when the change was made as opposed to who made the change. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Default update of current user. Will the history record carry the before image or the after image of the value in that into the record that generates when you make an update?
So if I understand you correctly, we have a string field in our original table, in our current table.
OS user,
Okay.
Default to OS user.
Okay.
Okay. So change comes in, DBA is trying to help, actually goes into something other than expected. You see his OS user ID in that field.
Mm-hmm.
Is the history record going to continue to show his ID or the ID of the previous update? In other words, you can put a before image for the rest of that row into that history table or an after image.
So it doesn't necessarily track who did it, it tracks what the data was, and we'll see that in the demo.
What?
Right. Sure. Any other questions? So another useful feature, not that any of us have encountered this, but recovering from accidental data loss, right? I did a delete without specifying my where clause, and whoops, there's more records lost than I had anticipated. So now I can actually roll it back, going back into my temporal table, and that's a different procedure, but nonetheless, it is available to you without having to call the DBA, get the database restored, and then move records back and forth. I'm sorry? So it would, right. So if you recall in the previous slide, the question is, how do you get it not to update the restore? If you recall, we specify system versioning on, we would specify system versioning off, and then what's going to happen is it's going to split the current table from the historical table. They will now operate as two separate entities. And then when I turn versioning back on, they are now married together as one entity. That's going to be in an upcoming demo.
Recovering all those rows, you're going to redo an insert into the primary original.
The current table.
That's going to generate change records in the history.
That's what I'm saying. Only if versioning is on. You have to turn it off. And we'll see that in just a little bit. So once we have everything set up, now if we want to query back to a specific point in time, we could use clauses like as of. So again, you see a simple select clause, or statement rather, select star from department for system underscore time as of, and we can specify a specific date. So it'll take us back to that point in time, and it'll show us all the current records that were current at that point. So as of is one of multiple clauses that are available to us. So we have as of, we can also specify the from and 2 or between. And I would caution you as you're exercising these clauses, pay close attention to the less than and less than equal to. That might trip you up. So essentially we have 5 clauses that will allow us to query the data for a specific point in time. So let's jump into a demo. And I have my script, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a temporal database. Will I upload the script? Absolutely. Now let's change database to temporal DB. I'm going to create a table for customers and territory managers. So I'm going to create my territory managers first, and then I'm going to reference that table in my customers table. Before I execute this, can everyone see this okay, by the way? Folks in the back? All right. So what I'm doing is I'm using the standard create table statement, specifying my ID, which is requirement number 1. Requirement number 2, I need the sys start time and sys end time. They have to be date time types with the generated always clause and not null for both the start and the end. I could name these fields whatever I want, but the name has to be consistent and specified here. And in addition, I have to specify period for system underscore time. And then when I'm done, I'm going to specify system versioning and turn that on. Now, again, before I execute this, we take a look at my database. Let's do a refresh. And I expand the tables, and I see territory managers has already been created. What folders do I see under a typical table? I see columns, keys, constraints, and so forth, right? Now let's execute this customers table with versioning turned on. Go ahead and execute that, and then refresh. Now I see my territory managers, but notice the icon for the customers table. I have what appears to be a clock symbol, and then as I expand that, give it a second. Not only do I see the folders for columns, keys, and constraints, but I also see another table, and notice how it's titled history. Now, another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to alter the customers table to add in a foreign key for the managers. And that completed successfully. Now, time to insert records. So I'm going to insert into territory managers, just some fictitious names. And here I'm going to insert 3 customer records that essentially connect to these managers with a foreign key at the end here. I'll execute that. And then, of course, here's what my result set looks like for querying the 2 tables that I created. Nothing out of the ordinary. Now, if I query my customers and customers historical table, you'll see that my customers table has the 3 records that I created, but my historical table is empty. In addition, you'll see that I have an identical I have an identical schema of the current table with the history table. I have the ID, the first name, last name, address, and so forth, including especially the last 2 fields, sys start and sys end. Since I just created it a second ago, notice the time that's specified here. And yes, this is UTC format. So I specified the time, but then notice the end time. So what this is telling me is this record became active at this point in time, and because the end time is essentially infinity in terms of SQL Server, the record is still active. And I have nothing in the historical table because my current table is still current, for lack of a better word. There were no changes made to it. No, sir. The bottom one is my historical. Top one is current. Are we good so far?
So when we do the initial insert data, already temporal table is already created, right?
That's because I created it from the start.
Yeah.
Right,
So the initial insert don't get affected with the temporal table.
right, because it's an initial insert. So what existed before the insert? Nothing, right?
So further insert of the further records also they won't get affected with the temporal. Won't change will get.
Correct. Okay, so let's go ahead and make some changes. So I have a user and she's going to change her email, and I'm going to pick on user number 2. So I'll go ahead and execute that. So now she changed her email to yahoo.com, and initially it was at outlook.com, Tina at outlook.com. And then she wasn't happy with the Yahoo address, so she changed it again to the Hotmail address. And you'll notice that executed, no issue. And then she changed it to a mailx.com, and I'm going to put in an intentional delay here. So we're going to wait for 3 seconds and then do the update. So now we have 3 updates. When I select from the customers table, and just the customers tables alone, it gives me the current record or the most current data, right? Everything in the current table has a sysend time of infinity, essentially. When I query it along with my historical table, I see that I have 3 records for Tina, and notice the start time and the end time. So only for Tina, and I believe she was this one. So you notice the last record was updated at 20 and 22. And there we have it. So there were 3 changes that started at 2019, and they lasted until 2022. From 2022 to 2022 and 35 seconds, the value was yahoo.com. And then from that point in time to that point in time, it was Hotmail. So if you look at it closely, you'll see that the end time here in the historical table matches the start time of the next record, and so on all the way down the line. But looking at my current table, because I queried just the current table alone, everything in there has a date of infinity and end time. I will give you the ubiquitous consulting answer. It depends, right? What does it depend on? What does it depend on? How big the data is, how often I'm updating. What happens if it gets wrapped in a transaction? Man, everybody's one step ahead of me. I like that. We'll cover that in a second. Right. Ed. Yes. I got a question, sir.
Space, I was just curious what sort of space issue you're running into with the additional overhead.
So because it's historical, and because I'm maintaining a historical record and the schema is the same, for all intents and purposes, I'm essentially, I don't want to say double, but because the historical table could grow to be a lot bigger number of records than the current table. However, it has to be the same schema. So I hate to say it again, but it depends. How many records would you have in there? Okay, it's essentially another table that's being maintained in the database. That I'd have to look into for you. And for questions that I cannot answer off the top, I have some business cards here. I would appreciate it if we could follow up afterwards. Okay? Any other questions?
What would happen if you wanted to go change the link?
If I wanted to,
Change the link, bar chart 50 to bar chart 100.
okay,
Are you having an issue because the history table is tied to
Right, so if I do any database schema changes, I have to turn versioning off, make the change to both tables, then turn versioning back on. And we'll do that in an upcoming demo as well. Okay, Ian?
And that's something you probably have a demo, but are you allowed to modify the historical table, or does the SQL Server know that since version's on, that it error is telling you that you can't do it when it's currently being versioned?
So yes and yes. It will give you, the question is, for those if you haven't heard it, if you modify the schema for the historical table, will SQL Server give you an error? Or if you turn versioning off and modify the historical table, will give you an error? So the answer is yes and yes, in the sense that you cannot modify either table with versioning being on. You have to turn versioning off. Once you make a modification, it has to be done to both tables. And then when versioning is turned on, there's a list of approximately a dozen or so issues that it checks. If any of those are not true, it cannot turn versioning back on. Exactly. Right.
Okay, that's what I was gonna ask. I think what he's talking about is the data history.
Yeah.
Change the data in the history.
Okay, so the data is different.
Yep, well, that's.
So I can purge the data and
Purge it, but can you change it? Can you fudge it?
Yeah, basically, it's like, is this, I'm trying to avoid that, right? The whole point is this is so I know that at that date and time, that's what that value was, just trying to make sure it's not easily fudged.
so I think you can modify the data records itself with versioning off, and I don't think that's going to be a part of the schema check or the check in general. But we can put that to the test afterwards. Can I click on this one? Okay. So it's essentially, it's another table nested within a table. I'm sorry, click on index. Right.
It would index every column.
There you go. So now if I want to actually query the data, let's see, for Tina W, I want to see what it was at this point in time, so I'm going to do a little cut and paste. And there, when I query for that point in time, it shows me what the email was for her, which was at that point in time, it was the Yahoo address. And notice that it returned only 3 records. It doesn't show any historical data. So basically, we just took a step back in time at that specific point and said, what was the current data at that interval? Also, I can specify additional clauses such as the from, and excuse my cut and paste for just a second. Unfortunately, I have to cut and paste because I just created the data on the fly. So we'll modify the start and end dates, Control V. And once again here, we're specifying a time span. And there it brings us back, and it shows that it was the Hotmail address at that point in time. So, then it will show you those 2 records as well, along with the sys start and sys end. So these 2 columns essentially maintain the data integrity, if you will, for the historical versioning. I'm sorry? A query for the time in the future. So which field would you like me to modify? The end date here? Okay. So if I modify the end date, let's go to 2020, and we query that. Then you see it gives me the historical records from that point in time, and which includes the record that started at this point in time, as well as the record that's currently active. So I see two records for Tina, one that was alive or active during this time frame, and then the most recent one because we're now looking into the future. So we're getting, okay, so if I change the start time to, let's say, let's go to April 30th, 2019, and I do a select. So this is the from. So it comes back with these being the current, and then in the from, if we go back to our slide deck, so the from is looking for less than for both the end date and the start date. Okay? Absolutely. Yeah. I wish I could take credit for it. I'm just the messenger. What's the one thing I'm missing? You said I'm only missing one thing. Oh, who? Oh, yeah, yeah. So again, in an upcoming slide, you'll see the who is described by CT and CDC, and that's already in existence. Okay? So I'm going to fast forward, and one of the clauses that I have is the all. So I specify select from the customers table for system time all. When I execute that, that brings back everything. So what it's doing here, exactly. So it's unioning the historical table and the current table and giving me the current records. Again, I cannot forego these two fields. This is what tells me what was active at that point in time. So we had another question regarding transactions. So let's do, again, we're going to pick on Tina. We're going to do a transaction here. We're going to update the email several times. We're going to do a delay. Let's turn down the delay here just a little bit, from 4 seconds down to 1. And then here as well. So what I'm going to do is when I start this transaction, it's going to print the start time. It's going to do one update, have a 1 second delay, another update, another 1 second delay, a third update, and then it will tell me that the transaction has been committed. So before I commit this transaction, what I wanted to show is the rollback. And so let's execute this. So we begin our transaction. There, it displayed that it started at 16:34 and 42 seconds. I have 1 row affected, 2, and 3. And then I have my rollback for the transaction. So now when I query my table, customers and customer historical, so you see the last update was for Tina to have a live3.com address. And when we look at our current, we don't see a live3 address. Likewise, when we look at our historical table, we don't see anything. The lesson here is whenever we roll back a transaction, nothing appears anywhere. Not in the historical and not in the current table. I'm sorry? What happens if I don't introduce an artificial delay?
What you're really asking is,
Oh, the timing. Okay,
at the time 7,
right.
that's not defined or anything as the system. So what happens? You actually get two updates on the same day.
Okay, so I'm going to leave the time delay in for just a second, and I'll answer that with a demo. And what we're going to do is comment out the rollback and uncomment the commit. So what we're doing here is, keep in mind, we're printing the time before and after the transaction. begin and run. So it started at 16:36 and 25 seconds. It ended at 16:36 and 27 seconds. Now when I do my query, basically it recorded it at the beginning of the transaction. So it uses the end time, regardless of the delay that's built in, it uses the begin time of the transaction for that end time field.
Expands that time until we return every row where that time is concerned.
So what I did here is I just did a query at select star from, right? The point is with a transaction, obviously I put in a delay. So I had a begin time and an end time. What ends up getting recorded is the begin time of the transaction in the date time fields. Does that answer your question? Okay, very good. Any other questions?
Yes, it came with the DeLorean.
It came with a DeLorean? It's data time travel, sir, not real time, unfortunately. I had a question, sir? Is it going to mess up the query? Right, so I got two records here that have the same start time and end time. So essentially, yes. Because it was all done in a transaction. Correct. Well, the delay was after the print of the start time. Yeah. So here, this was the start of the transaction. We printed the time. We did an update, and then we had the delay here.
The reason for this is so you don't have any gaps in your start time and end time. You don't have any gaps in there. By using the transaction start time, it almost guarantees it.
Right.
That's good.
And like I mentioned earlier, I mean, with the transaction aside, your end time of one record will match the start time of the other record. Okay. Other questions? All right, so now what happens if I just delete a record from the historical table? We do a delete from customer's historical table, and we get an error message. Cannot delete from a temporal history table because I have versioning turned on, right? So I cannot delete a historical record. If I turn versioning off, right. If you're that much of a stickler about security, yes, yes. Delete a table from the primary? Delete? Oh, okay, so that will be coming up next. Not immediately, but soon. So in this demo, what I'm going to do is actually modify the table. And I'm going to do this in a transaction. The first thing I need to do in that transaction, turn versioning off. Then I'm going to alter the customers table, add in an email field, call it alt email 2, varchar 20. Actually, it should be varchar 8000, right? For all the DBAs in the room? Maybe not? Okay. Max. And so what I'm going to do purposely is I'm not going to make a change to the historical table. And then I'm going to attempt to turn versioning back on and do it all in a transaction. So we're modifying one table and not the other. And there we get, it failed to turn it back on. And so now what I need to do is actually modify the historical table. Oops, let's do that again. And so I can do a modification only when versioning is turned off and only to both tables, and then turn versioning back on.
You have to do it in
Do I have to do it in a transaction? I should, but I don't have to. Yes, sir. So the question is, if I turn versioning off on my historical tables and I make a change to my current table, what if a transaction comes in during that time period? So yes, that will be data that won't be maintained historically. Not maintained historically, sorry. It's not so much a transaction, it's more of making sure that I don't get any records in during that time period. Okay? So now I'm going to update the email for a customer. And this is for a customer with ID is 3. And then when I select from both tables, where's customer number 3? Where are you? There's ID 3, Samuel Johnson, and there he is. So basically, even though the change was the same, meaning I changed the email from the old value to the new value, essentially the email to itself, as in this statement, basically it still maintained a history of it. It didn't do a check. There was no intelligence built in there. It was just a standard historical versioning. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Start and end time, or am I going to use the column to find it?
Okay, so the question again, you have a table with 1,000,000 rows. You make a change to one record.
Yeah, this is got a whole lot of.
Right. But keep in mind, the historical table also maintains the ID. So it's an ID field, but keep in mind, it is not a primary key in this case. As you see, it's maintaining history of that ID column.
I got to search on that.
You got to search on that ID and then pinpoint it with the start and end time. You can, but then you're getting all the IDs that may have changed during that time frame. Mm-hmm. So you can turn the entire database back, or the entire table rather, and select for that time period. It's the ID field. I'm a .NET developer, but that doesn't mean I'm a bad database designer. Cut me some slack.
I'm talking the history table.
The history table. Okay, so the history table. All right, so if we go to the historical table and we do script table as create query window. There, my ID is just an integer field. Yeah, so the indexes are already open, and there is a clustered. So it's a clustered index on the two fields.
I was actually going to ask, because the way this works, if those were defaultedly indexed, and I answered that question.
The question is defaultedly a word? That's the bigger question. Just kidding. All right, so where did we leave off at? So we set, So here we prove that there was no intelligence built into the versioning. Essentially, if we make any modification, it's just going to mirror it in the historical table. Now, a question came up earlier. What happens if we just do a delete from the customers table? So we do a delete from customers where ID equals 1. I had one row deleted. Now, if I do a selection, I did. I just deleted the first customer. Okay? Simply because I can, right? I'm sorry?
You know whether that was a delete without inferring by the historical table, not the primary table.
So the question is, if I look in the historical table and I see a delete, will I see a reference? Okay, let's get to that. So what I did was I deleted customer ID 1, okay? So obviously when I query here, I see IDs 2 and 3, customer ID 1 is completely gone from the current table. When I look in the historical table, and let's upsize it, there I see all of Tina's records and user number 3, and then here's user number 1. So user number 1, this record, for lack of a better word, was alive or current between 1954, 19 minutes and 54 seconds, and 2046 and 35 seconds. So since I specify an end time here, and I don't have it in my current table, it's inferring that it's deleted. Okay? Oh. So in our create options, initially I said that we can do everything in one statement and we can specify the name of the historical table. In this case, basically, I'm going to define the department 1 table, and notice that I have system versioning turned on and I have all my fields that I'm required to have, but I am not specifying the table name. So if we go ahead and execute this, and let's refresh our database. Go under tables. We'll see that we have a department 1 table. And as we expand it and wait anxiously, there you have a very user-friendly name. Or not so user-friendly, however you want to look at it. Okay. Also, some additional options is I can just specify the name of the history table. So here, this we've done before, where we specified the name of the history table. And then another thing I can do is I can create the historical table, create the schema, create that, and then set up the indexing, and then create my current table, and then marry the two with this clause where I'm turning versioning on. Why would you want to do it that way? In case you had another table where you had the records in there and you wanted to, supposing that you were doing it the old-fashioned way with triggers and whatnot, and you wanted to maintain those records, this is one way to do it. Okay? And how convenient is that? It's not. Right. So naturally, something that is out of the box, built into the engine, is a lot better and a lot more durable than something that we would build by hand, right? So if I want to purge the historical table, first I would have to turn the versioning off using the alter statement, I would delete records from the historical table, and then I would turn versioning back on. Notice here, I'm not doing it in a transaction. And before I do it, just for reference, I'm going to query both tables. So I see 2 records in my current table, and I see 8 records in my historical table. I'll go ahead and execute these 3 statements. So cannot delete rows from a temporal history table. And let's try that again. We're going to turn versioning off. We're going to delete from the historical table. And now we're going to turn versioning back on. And now when we select from both tables, there we see that I purged from the historical table where the ID equals 2. So here I have no records of user with ID 2. And I turned versioning back on, so now I can maintain history in my table. Well, I mean, eventually you're going to accrue millions and millions of rows, right? So do you care about data from 10, 15 years ago? Probably not, right? In some places, yes, that's true. Okay, any questions? Yes, sir.
Okay. Kind of, yeah. So we put a part of the historical data.
Correct.
That implies that I want to get useful state. Therefore, I can actually set up completely different permissions on this historical data.
Yes.
Which answers a lot of the questions you were having around who gets to edit that.
Yes.
And we're going to touch on that in an upcoming slide as well. Okay. Yes, sir. So the question is, are there integrity issues if I try to query ID2? From where? The historical or current? From historical. Right. So naturally, if I query it, it's going to bring back 0 rows because there is no user with ID of 2 in the historical table. Okay? So it's not an error. I legitimately deleted it on purpose. I did what I was supposed to do, versioning off, then versioning back on. Okay. Another question, sir? You're allowed, by the way.
Temporal keywords that's great. If you use the keywords, it's great history.
I'm not querying with the temporal keyword, sir.
I'm saying if you were. I'm saying.
Okay, so.
If you write a query with the table name in it, it's just going to query against the table. But if you add like start date in, then it's going to look at the historical table.
Right. So anytime I execute a select clause with any of these 4 subclauses, what it's doing is it's going to query both tables, union the result set, and then produce that. And then it is up for you to dissect the start time and end time and see. Actually, I take that back. If you're identifying the start and end time, it will bring back a union of records from both current and historical. If you happen to have 2 updates within that time period, it will reflect that. Okay, we're running a little short on time, but I promise to let you go by 5 o'clock. So, with that said, as we mentioned earlier, whenever I turn versioning off and turn it back on, that on switch will immediately check for these 10 conditions. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but as just a quick scan, you'll see that the names and the number of columns has to be the same in both tables. The date types, the data types rather, they must match. The period columns for my start and end date, they have to be there and set to not null. No identity columns are defined in the history table. We just have an ID field that's an integer, not a primary ID. There was a question regarding security principles, if you guys care about that sort of thing. Sarcastic. So for enabling or disabling versioning, you need to have the system versioning. It requires control permissions on both tables. So that means I can set up a user to query the current table, but not. All right, so.
That is the most final ending ever.
And on that note, thank you all for coming. I will post the rest of the slide deck. Thank you. Again, business cards up here. If there's a question that I need to get back to you on, I would appreciate it if you'd email me and we can continue the conversation. Thank you all for coming. Oh, that was completely unexpected. Thank you.